Hello and welcome to the Brothers' War. Previously, we covered the striking of the spark with the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and today we will cover the impacts of that and give a glimpse of the violence that will ensue and the fire that will spread. John Brown was born May 9, 1800 to the iron-willed Calvinist Owen Brown, who imparted on John the same work ethic, the same sternness, the same radical Christianity, and an even greater will. As a child, John lived in the Ohio Territory, one of the hotbeds of anti-slavery activity in the U.S. John worked as a cowhand, and at the age of 12, while rounding up strays, he chanced to see a slave boy being beaten fiercely by his master. This image was burned into John's mind, and combining with his hardcore Calvinist religious beliefs, he forged an ironclad opposition to slavery. Just phrasing it as opposition to slavery is probably drastically underemphasizing the extent and fervor of John Brown's beliefs. Even among radical abolitionists, John was considered radical. And while I am admittedly putting words in his mouth, it's not a stretch to say that John Brown's beliefs could be summed up as, God said, "Do unto others as you would have them do unto you, so I will free the slaves, or die trying." He joined his father's congregation at 16 and tried to become a clergyman, but he failed. He could not raise the funds or pay his way through the seminary required to become a clergyman, so he moved to Pennsylvania after he got married and tried to raise his small army of sons. He would always struggle financially. Throughout his whole life, he'd be active in the Underground Railroad and in abolitionist circles across the country, and would roam and ramble across the country until he became an old man, and will re-enter our story later. Eli Thayer, Massachusetts abolitionist, just before the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, would formulate a plan. Along with other wealthy abolitionists, they would funnel as many like-minded individuals into Kansas as they could. Although Nebraska was also created at this time, its proximity to the free state of Iowa led many to guess, correctly it would turn out, that it would become a free state as well. Thayer formed the New England Emigrant Aid Society to enable this. The strategy was that if these New Englanders could hang on for a while and prove Kansas was in fact livable, other free soilers would come from what is now the Midwest and settle there as well. Ideally, Kansas would then be admitted to the Union as a free state, in theory driving a wedge between the slave states and the West, preventing any further expansion and hopefully putting enough pressure on the plantation system to bring about its collapse. Hundreds of free soilers volunteered, and their journeys were financed. The company departed Boston on the 17th of July, 54. Meanwhile, a flood of pro-slavery settlers from Missouri entered Kansas. With the best land already claimed by Native Americans, these settlers would lay claim to the second best land. When they heard about these abolitionist settlers coming in from New England, they jeered and laughed, and they said that they'd kill them all, without difficulty. Likewise, a mass settlement of largely apolitical but vaguely anti-slavery settlers from Ohio, Illinois, and Indiana settled in Kansas quietly. This is all happening before the Kansas-Nebraska Act was actually passed, but when it became apparent that it would. So, when it was actually passed, the abolitionist settlers made it to Kansas, and the free state hub of Lawrence was set up shortly thereafter by these new English immigrants, followed by other colonies in Topeka, Manhattan, Waubonsee, and Osawatomie. The anti-slavery settlers, called the Free Staters or the Free Soilers, not to be confused with the party, that doesn't really exist anymore anyways, would move in quite suddenly and abruptly and take up a considerable amount of land quite quickly, which spooked the pro-slavery forces, who organized themselves into informal militia groups and fraternities to defend their pro-slavery interests. When Andrew Reeder, the appointed governor, arrived in October of 1854, tensions between all three of these groups, the Free Soilers, the pro-slavery, and the Neutrals, are already pretty high, and several extrajudicial killings and murders and mob actions have already happened. By this point, Kansas has already got a reputation as a dangerous place, and no neutrals are moving into Kansas. And almost all these radicals moving in are free soil. Nearly all of them are armed, and recognizing this, the Missouri militias muster, hold meetings, and plan attacks. On November 29th, the election to determine the delegate to Congress was held, and armed men streamed across the border from Missouri to vote, stuffing the ballots and intimidating free staters, who are beginning to realize that the ruffians mean violence. A lot of violence, too, not just isolated incidents of murder and house torching. It is around this time that John Brown and Sons will set up camp near Potawatomi. By this point, he has failed 20 business ventures in 6 states, but is renowned throughout abolitionist circles, if not regarded as a little kooky and very willing to use violence. On March 30th, 1855, the following year, the election for the Territorial Legislature is held, and this is the critical vote. It is this elected body that will write the Constitution and appeal for statehood that will be submitted to Washington, and in those documents, the slave status of Kansas will be determined. This is the vote everyone has been waiting for. The fate of Kansas and of slavery is in this legislature's hands. So, much like last year, the pro-slavery border ruffians from Missouri vote en masse, putting the Free Soilers at literal gunpoint to refuse them from voting. In some cases, the ruffians change clothes to vote multiple times. Vote. Take your coat off. Vote. Put your coat back on, shave your beard. Vote. Take your coat off again. Vote. Put your coat back on and shave your mustache. Vote. Take off your coat again and shave your head. Vote. Put some glasses on. Vote. And on this charade of democracy went. David Atchison, the biggest pro-slavery rabble-rouser and Stephen Douglas's co-author on the Kansas-Nebraska Act, said, "We've come to vote and will vote or kill every damned abolitionist in the territory." So all of this worked, and the ruffians got a pro-slavery legislature elected. Governor Reeder ordered new elections, and the ruffians just ignored the new results and assembled a legislature according to the fraudulent original results. The rabidly pro-slavery legislature passed such laws as making it a felony to even criticize slavery, and assigned the death penalty on aiding runaway slaves, far in excess of what the new fugitive slave law requires. They barred Free Soilers from holding office and jury duty. The Free Staters, of course, proclaimed the elections and therefore the Territorial Congress and therefore these laws to be fraudulent. The Free Staters held their own elections, called their own legislature, and wrote their own state constitution in October in Topeka, outlawing slavery. They would elect their own governor, James Lane, and would subsequently submit a petition to Congress asking for entry to the Union as a free state. John Brown's son, John Jr., was a representative. John Jr. is also starting to get organized and will form the Potawatomi Rifles, deciding that in light of the Fed refusing to step in and fix the situation with the fraudulent government, it's time to take matters into our own hands. John Sr. was also active in local organizations at Osawatomie. He was in attendance at a meeting of nearby settlers when the question of, hey, what do we do if someone tries to make us follow the pro-slavery laws and pay taxes to the pro-slavery government, came up. Tempers were getting heated and voices were being raised, but they were silenced when John Brown took to the floor and calmly introduced himself as an abolitionist. He stated he would rather see the Union burn than pay any taxes to the ruffian government, even though he owned no land and subsequently would not have to pay them a cent. He promised that he would kill any agent of the government, territorial or federal, who attempted to coerce him into paying these taxes. This scared the pants off of every conservative in the group, who immediately left rather than spend another minute in the room with this madman, leaving behind men who wholeheartedly agreed with Brown's assessment and voted in his favor, and published the conclusions of this meeting in public. The sparks are catching. Alright, time to take a break from Kansas real quick, because as all of this is going on, the Republican Party is really starting to come into its own. While the anti-Nebraska coalition was fairly unified, the Know-Nothings really dominated the coalition in terms of seats and representatives. While the tensions in Kansas thus far have been a windfall growth for the Republicans so far, who I remind you are almost exclusively in the North, the Know-Nothings were split in both northern and southern camps. In June of '55, at the first convention, the party's Central Committee passed a platform supporting the Kansas-Nebraska Act, a platform which drove most Northerners out of the Know-Nothings and into the Republicans. So now, the Know-Nothings are primarily a party representing the South. But, after a major defeat in the race for Virginia governor, it became apparent the Know-Nothings could not win in the South either. The Know-Nothings platform could not defeat the Southern Democrats' states' rights platform. At this point, Republican and former leader of the Free Soilers, Salmon Chase, won the governorship of Ohio by explicitly appealing to the now fragmented Know-Nothings, rejecting the platform's nativist policies, like its restrictions to office holding and citizenship, and simultaneously embracing its nationalism. This deft maneuver allowed him to win over both the key Know-Nothing remnant demographic and the growing German immigrant demographic, and therefore the governorship. Other Republicans like Seward were able to paint a not inaccurate picture of the slave power conspiracy literally sending ruffians and thugs into Kansas to illegally vote and sway the elections, and point out that this tiny oligarchy of 350,000 slave owners, barely 1 in 100 of the entire population, was making the remainder of the country dance to their tune. Why do we have to listen to them? He pointed out that free speech on the issue of slavery would literally constitute treason in Kansas, and this was indicative of slave power's desire to extend their reach into Kansas and subsequently make a left hook into the North. Now, he was not in favor of disunion, and the party he represented was not explicitly abolitionist, but he was clearly saying right here and now the Republican Party's embrace of non-extensionist thought, and that slave power would not be allowed to spread any further. This was followed by another speech by the Republican Charles Sumner from Massachusetts, who was an abolitionist. His famous Crime Against Kansas speech, which took so long it took him 2 separate sessions on 2 different days to read, includes the following passages of note, and I will be skipping around here a lot. Take down your map, sir, and you will find that the territory of Kansas occupies the middle spot of North America, equally distant from the Atlantic on the east and the Pacific on the west, from the frozen waters of Hudson's Bay on the north and the tepid Gulf Stream on the south, constituting the precise territorial center of the whole vast continent. Against this territory, thus fortunate in position and population, a crime has been committed, which is without example in the records of the past. The very shrines of popular institutions, more sacred than any heathen altar, have been desecrated, where the ballot box, more precious than any work, in ivory or marble, from the cunning hand of art has been plundered, and where the cry, "I am an American citizen," has been interposed in vain against outrage of every kind, even upon life itself. Are you against sacrilege? I present it for your execration. Are you against robbery? I hold it up to your scorn. Are you for the protection of American citizens? I show you how their dearest rights have been cloven down while a tyrannical usurpation has sought to install itself on their very necks. The whole world, alike Christian and Turk, is rising up to condemn this wrong, and make it a hissing to the nations. Here in our republic, force, aye sir, force, has been openly employed in compelling Kansas to this pollution, and all for the sake of political power. Here is the simple fact, which you will vainly attempt to deny, but which in itself presents an essential wickedness that makes other public crimes seem like public virtues. The strife is no longer local, but national. Even now, while I speak, portents hang on all the arches of the horizon, threatening to darken this broad land, which already yawns with the musterings of civil war. The fury of the propagandists of slavery and the calm determination of their opponents are now diffused from the distant territory over widespread communities and the whole country in its extent, marshalling hostile divisions and foreshadowing a strife which, unless happily averted by the triumph of freedom, will become war. Even so, to the creature whose paws are now fastened upon Kansas, whatever it may seem to be, constitutes in reality a part of the slave power, which, with loathsome folds, now coiled about the whole land. But, before entering upon the argument, I must say something of a general character, particularly in response to what has fallen from senators who have raised themselves to eminence on this floor, in championship of human wrongs. I mean the senator from South Carolina, and the senator from Illinois. The senator from South Carolina has read many books of chivalry, and believes himself a chivalrous knight with sentiments of honor and courage. Of course, he has chosen a mistress to whom he has made his vows, and who, though ugly to others, is always lovely to him. Though polluted in the sight of the world, she is chaste in his sight. I mean the harlot, slavery. The asserted rights of slavery, which shock equality of all kinds, are cloaked by the fantastic claim of equality. If the slave states cannot enjoy what, in mockery of the great fathers of the Republic, he misnames equality under the Constitution, in other words, the full power in the national territories to compel fellow men to unpaid toil, to separate husband and wife, and to sell little children at the auction block, then, sir, the chivalric senator will conduct the state of South Carolina out of the Union. Heroic knight, exalted senator, a second Moses come for a second Exodus. The senator from Illinois is the squire of slavery. It's very Sancho Panza, ready to do all its humiliating offices. This senator, in his labored address, vindicating his labored report, piling one mass of elaborate error upon another mass, constrained himself, as you will remember, to unfamiliar decencies of speech. True to his native impulses, he threw into this discussion, for charm of powerful trouble, personalities most discreditable to this body. I will not stop to repel the imputations which he cast upon myself, but I mention them to remind you of the sweltered venom sleeping got, which, with other poisoned ingredients, he cast into the cauldron of this debate. Standing on this floor, the senator issued his rescript, requiring submission to the usurped power of Kansas, and this was accompanied by a manner all his own, such as benefits the tyrannical threat. Very well. Let the senator try. I tell him now that he cannot enforce any such submission. The senator, with the slave power at his back, is strong, but he is not strong enough for this purpose. He is bold. He shrinks from nothing. Like Danton, he might cry, "L'audace, l'audace, l'audace, l'audace." But even his audacity cannot compass this work. The senator copies the British officer, who with boastful swagger says that with the hilt of his sword he would cram the stamps down the throats of the American people, and he will meet a similar failure. He may convulse this country with civil feud. Like the ancient madman, he may set fire to the temple of constitutional liberty, grander than the Ephesian dome, but he cannot enforce obedience to that tyrannical usurpation. The senator dreams that he can subdue the North. He disclaims the open threat, but his conduct still implies it. How little that senator knows himself, or the strength of the cause which he persecutes. He is but a mortal man, against him his an immortal principle. With finite power, he wrestles with the infinite, and he must fall. Against him are stronger battalions than any marshaled by mortal man, the inborn, ineradicable, invincible sentiments of the human heart. Against him is nature in all her subtle forces. Against him is God. Let him try to subdue these. Sumner then describes in great detail the theft of freedom and emancipation from the people of Kansas by the border ruffians, and how peaceful Free State settlers have been stabbed and shot, and how their free speech has been taken from them, and how they've been made to suffer abuses at all kinds from a fraudulently elected government. He goes on to say that the most absurd apologetics have come forth for this crime upon Kansas, describing them as tyrannical, imbecile, absurd, infamous. This is all. Tyranny, imbecility, absurdity, and infamy all unite to dance like the weird sisters about this crime. Calling out Reader and the militias and Southern armed fraternities, the lying pro-slavery newspapers and the overbearing pro-slavery government, as well as pro-slavery members of Congress. He then proposes the remedy. In short, justice and peace, and bids the president to ignore Douglas and end slavery in Kansas. He continues, "Sir, the people of Kansas, bone of your bone, flesh of your flesh, with the education of freemen, the rights of American citizens now stand at your door. Will you send them away, or bid them enter? Will you push them back to renew their struggles with a deadly foe, or will you preserve them in security and peace? Will you cast them again into the den of tyranny, or will you help their despairing efforts to escape? Read the Declaration of Independence, and there is hardly an accusation which is there directed against the British monarch which may not now be directed with increased force against the American president. Surely a president who has done all these things cannot be less unfit than a prince. At every stage, the responsibility is brought directly to him. His offense has been both of commission and omission. He has done that which he ought not to have done, and he has left undone which he ought to have done. By his activity, the prohibition of slavery was overturned. By his failure to act, the honest emigrants in Kansas have been left a prey to wrong of all kinds, and now he stands forth the most conspicuous enemy of that unhappy territory." After some final shots at Douglas and Butler, which are some real zingers, I'd highly recommend finding the text of the Crime Against Kansas page. It's on Wikipedia. He concludes, "The contest, which, beginning in Kansas, has reached us, will soon be transferred from Congress to a broader stage, where every citizen will be not only spectator, but actor. And to their judgment I confidently appeal, in dutiful respect for the early fathers, whose aspirations are now ignobly thwarted in the name of the Constitution, which has been outraged, of the laws trampled down, of justice banished, of humanity degraded, of peace destroyed, of freedom crushed to the earth, and in the name of the Heavenly Father, whose service is freedom, I make this last appeal." 3 days later, Senator Preston Brooks, relative of Butler, confronted Sumner on the Senate floor, and I'll let Sumner describe what happens from there. His account reads, "While thus intent, with my head bent over my writing, I was addressed by a person who approached the front of my desk. I was so entirely absorbed that I was not aware of his presence until I heard my name pronounced. As I looked up with pen in hand, I saw a tall man standing directly over me, and at the same moment I caught these words, 'I have read your speech twice over, carefully. It is a libel on South Carolina, and Mr. Butler, who is a relative of mine.' While these words were still passing from his lips, he commenced a succession of blows with a heavy cane upon my bare head, but the first of which I was stunned so as to lose my sight. I saw no longer my assailant, nor any other person in the room. Senator Charles Sumner was savagely beaten by Preston Brooks on the Senate floor with a cane on May 22, 1856, and left on the floor, bleeding profusely, until the sergeant-at-arms carried him out unconscious. The vote to censure Brooks and expel him from the Senate failed. Brooks resigned and then was immediately re-elected in the vote to replace him. The cane shattered during the beating, and the shards were auctioned off for thousands of dollars. The 45-year-old Sumner would take 3 years to fully recover and would suffer from the symptoms of traumatic brain injury and PTSD for the rest of his life. It was also now common practice for congressmen to concealed carry on the Senate floor. Thanks for watching. If you liked it, give it a like. If you didn't, a dislike. In the comments, you can leave constructive criticism, suggestions for special episodes, questions for the Q&A, and whatever else you'd like to put in there. Please be sure to share this video with the history buff in your life, and we will conclude with the words of a Connecticut schoolgirl written shortly after the beating of Charles Sumner, whose name remains lost to history. "I don't think it is of very much use to stay any longer in high school. The boys would be better learning to hold muskets, and the girls to make bullets."